In this segment, I want to present some ideas related to what's called non-ordinary states of consciousness. I hope to not get bogged down. When we start talking about consciousness, it can explode into any number of different directions. I came across the phrase non-ordinary or extreme states of consciousness from the work of Stanislav and Christina Grof. Stanislav, he's retired now. He's in his early 90s. He's from Czechoslovakia and is a psychiatrist who immigrated to the United States back in either the late 60s or the early 1970s. When he was in medical school, he was in a LSD experiment where he was part of the group that received the LSD and had a different state of consciousness. In his case, he reached a realm that involved, I guess I would call it divinity, this just totally mystical, totally loving, peaceful, exciting even. And I guess that's all together. But through that, he came to recognize, or he came to experience that consciousness is actually something outside of our physical body. It's something we can approach, these different states of consciousness. And that led him into work of how LSD could potentially be used to help people in distressed states of consciousness. The phrase altered states of consciousness often comes up, and there's a couple interviews. Thankfully, Dr. Grof had a number of interviews, number of lectures that are available online. And I've heard him say multiple times that he didn't care for the phrase altered state of consciousness, because he says alter, that's what you do to a dog when you want to fix the dog. So for me now, when I come across altered state of consciousness, I think of Fido. So before we start talking about non-ordinary states, we probably ought to spend a moment talking about what is consciousness. This is one of those words where we can end up with 25 different definitions quite easily. I took a stab at it after thinking about it a bit and said that consciousness is a state of being and awareness of your environment, experiences, thoughts, and beliefs, and the interaction with those elements. A few days ago, I was reading through a book by June Singer named Boundaries of the Soul, where she actually provided a description of consciousness. She had her PhD in psychology. She had studied at the Jung Institute in Zurich, Switzerland, and then went on to get a PhD. But she said that consciousness is that level of awareness that is achieved by the individual through his perceptions and understanding of his world and of himself. Of course, that could be a her in there, but it does match somewhat to what I was thinking along those lines. So what affects consciousness? I personally think almost anything and everything. Moving into more detail, things like weather, things like the clothes you wear, things that affect your physical state, including exercise, sleep is a different state of consciousness, whether you're hungry or not, the type of food you eat, the environment around you. Is there, what's the lighting? What's the decorations in the room you're in? Are you outside? Do you have animals that you interact with? And then, of course, your interpersonal relationships, including family, work. Are you constantly under stress? Do you perceive that as a growth opportunity, or is it something that's chronic that may affect your state of consciousness in what could be considered a more taxing way? Even something as simple as breath can affect consciousness. So even if you just take a few moments, take a couple of deeper breaths, how does that affect your feeling of the room you're in, the things you notice in the room or the area you're in, if you're outdoors? Did you notice a bird singing? Did you feel other energy around you? Just even my tone of voice could have an effect on the level of consciousness that others experience. So looking at consciousness, there's considerable variability, and we always change states of consciousness. as I just demonstrated a few moments ago. We can do it through breath, meditation, sometimes hypnosis, but even just basic things, something that might startle us. Going out and having stimulation would all affect consciousness. Oops. So then, having a concept of what consciousness is, we can talk about an ordinary range. So I just drew put together some examples here where individuals may operate within a certain range of their consciousness, including sleep, tied in with emotions and such. Another person might have a broader range of consciousness, maybe a broader awareness of certain things, less aware of other things. And someone else might have a very narrow range of consciousness. To look at it this way, it's very similar to when to talking about visibility wavelengths or auditory wavelengths, that we only experience a certain spectrum of or a certain range of a larger expansion. Dogs can hear at different frequencies that we can, or when they're hunting, they can sense energy that we can't. So that ties in with this variability within the range of consciousness. So within terms of a group of people would also then have a collective range of consciousness, looking at the percentage of time that people are within this range. It might be, 80% of people operate within a certain range of consciousness, or 90%. The percentages don't really matter. I grabbed a normal curve. I have a master's degree in statistics, so I'm kind of nerdy about graphs and that type of thing. But the idea is that a number of people are operating within kind of the bulk of this ordinary range of consciousness. As I try and depict, there's a couple people who are maybe out not in the central part. Maybe they're out on kind of the fringes, or I don't even necessarily like that word, but you get the gist here, that there's a range. Most people operate within that certain range. Within different groups, there might be different ranges of consciousness. Indigenous groups have different types of consciousness that are considered normal, that are considered ordinary. Other groups may not incorporate that. Looking at it more in two dimensions as opposed to on a linear line, we could look at this circle as representing a range. By doing this, what I'm trying to depict is that if I look at something just linearly and have a range, then I only have two possible options in the non-ordinary range of consciousness. Yet, if I look at it this way, that there's a kind of a field that I operate in, anything outside that field, which can go off in multiple different directions, could be considered part of a non-ordinary state of consciousness. And again, this can represent the range that an individual operates in, or presumably a larger range if there's a group of people and what's considered ordinary to that group of people. Again, being a nerd that I am in terms of math and statistics, I grabbed a bivariate normal distribution. Doesn't that sound impressive? Not really. But the gist is that, again, most people are operating within kind of this ordinary range of consciousness represented by this hill here. And again, this area around that becomes what could be considered a non-ordinary state. So again, there's a whole region, not just high or low, there's a whole large, vast area that could potentially be a non-ordinary state of consciousness. If we kick it up another notch into 3 dimensions, our range of consciousness might look like a sphere. It might look like some kind of amorphous blob. It could be a cube, it could be a pyramid, but it's basically some 3-dimensional figure. And again, the group of people operating within that realm would be in what culture and society would consider an ordinary range of consciousness, ordinary state of consciousness. Those outside could be considered as a non-ordinary state. Again, the purpose of why I'm trying to show it this way is that that area of non-ordinary states becomes significantly larger. It can go up, it can go down, it can go off at this angle or that angle. Much more diverse than the two-dimensional depiction. Now, I presented it this way intentionally because in another segment, my first segment, I spoke about the hero's journey, where, according to Joseph Campbell and his study of mythology, he popularized this concept of where a hero gets called to adventure. They move from a known realm into an unknown realm, go through a series of trials and tribulations, and then return back to that known realm, having experience, having knowledge, having what's called boon or elixir to share with that known realm. And so by showing these states of consciousness as I did, I'm trying to marry this together to say, hey, this known range of consciousness is the known realm. A number of people understand these different states of consciousness. They know how to function within it. But then there's still these unknown states of consciousness that some people seek. They actually use tools and techniques to reach these non-ordinary states, sometimes called expanded states. But then there's other people who end up in these non-ordinary states unintentionally. And that's where that quote that I used to name this YouTube channel of Joseph Campbell's that said, the psychotic person drowns in the same water that a mystic delights in. So basically, some of these non-ordinary states, some people learn how to swim. It's depicted by this little guy down here. Those would be the mystics. Other people fall in accidentally, or in my case, belly flop into those non-ordinary states, as represented by these little guys doing kind of a dead man float, or they're still in the act of belly flopping in, falling in inelegantly. They can fall in any number of different areas. So there's some considerations around that. Is how do people end up in those non-ordinary states? Again, as I said, some people seek it as their own personal journey. They've heard about it, they learn about it, they seek training in it, and then they work through it. And those tend to be those who end up training for this type of mystical consciousness. Another case is, though, people end up there accidentally. In my case, I didn't even know it existed. And that's why when I was first going through the breakdown in 1998, I was like, what is this? What is this I'm experiencing? And had I even had the concept of this is an extreme state of consciousness, you're hitting a level of consciousness, Penny. Other people have hit it. Other people learn how to deal with it. They learn how to come back into a less extreme state of consciousness. And there's stuff that you can learn from it. Boy, I wish I'd have been told that. So when it comes to these known and unknown realms, is the known realm something that a person wants to return to? If their life has been so stressful or so difficult, that may be a challenge. They may not want to return. Whatever state of consciousness they reach in a non-ordinary state may be something they're much more comfortable in. If they do want to return to the known realm, then how do we help someone navigate those turbulent waters? And actually, that was something I forgot to mention, is that out here, there are some violent currents. We talk about streams of consciousness, and yeah, that I experienced something quite violent. And I can laugh about it now. I couldn't at the time. But how do we help them back? And too often, what the approaches used actually push people further away. That's definitely what happened to me. I'll be talking more about that in the future. So how does this type of experience also affect not just the individual, but the people and loved ones around them? There's a lot of fear right now in terms of people accidentally falling into some of these non-ordinary states. And there is erratic behavior. There's an explosion of the subconscious in some cases. There's any number of ways to describe this, but to look at it as more of a process than an illness and a disorder might very well be more beneficial to the person experiencing it. And so also then, how can society gain more information and more knowledge about these non-ordinary states to help both the individual and the society they live in? And as I mentioned, I call myself an unintentional explorer. And not only that, on the homepage of my website, I say a quote of my own is that the person who makes the journey is in the best position to define the landscape. So in my case, I may have been swimming or floundering over here. Other people may experience completely different states of consciousness outside of that ordinary realm. And so their experiences will be very different than my own. So I might be able to define a certain path or a certain terrain that other people can't relate to, even though they've had these experiences, these extreme experiences. Some other considerations is in the last few years, I've actually done a bit more research on these non-ordinary states. I didn't really know who Stanislav and Christina Grof were, or even Joseph Campbell, until about 4 or 5 years ago. There was considerable work being done in the 1960s and 70s addressing consciousness. Now, yes, often with psychedelics. I should say I've never taken a psychedelic. I've never even smoked tobacco, much less anything more extreme than that. But there was a lot of research, as I mentioned. Stanislav Grof was led to that, or chose to move in that direction based on this experiment that he participated in, looking into how to help people through these extended or extreme states. And his work was especially focused on helping people diagnosed with, well, I shouldn't say focused specifically, but he worked to help people diagnosed with schizophrenia, which is often considered to be one of the more extreme states of consciousness. And he also recognized that some of the cases of what people experience is related to some of the symbolism out of these historic myths, similar to Joseph Campbell. And in their correspondence, and they actually, to my understanding, became quite good friends. Looking through their books, they reference each other quite a bit. And as I mentioned, some of us belly flop in, and then we have to try and figure out how to learn how to swim and float all on our own without proper instruction. It's one thing to try and learn how to do that before you hit those non-ordinary states. It's another when you accidentally fall in. It's like, what is this? How do I deal with that? And that's where I think we're not doing as good a job helping people understand what happens as we could be. One thing is, when it comes to the Campbell quote, Stan Grof didn't buy into the idea that the mystics are reveling or delighting in these waters that drown other people. A couple of years ago, I was working on a project and was on a Zoom call talking to a man and mentioned that quote, the psychotic drowning in the same water that the mystic delights in. And he found that quote to be quite interesting. He hadn't heard it. He was, I think he had a master's degree in psychology and counseling and had been in the industry for decades and had never come across this quote. And he said, hey, when we hang up, would you mind sending me that quote? And I said, no, sure, not a problem. And so before I sent it, I decided to try and see if I could find when Campbell first used that quote. So I Googled it, and in response, in the results, I noticed there was a book by Stanislav Grof called Psychology of the Future. And I thought, I wonder why that returned. And as it turned out, I had just bought that book a few months earlier. I hadn't read the complete book. I'd read just a couple chapters. So I pulled it out, checked the index. Sure enough, Joseph Campbell was listed. And I came across a section where Grof actually references that quote. And what he says at the end of the chapter is that the difference between mysticism and mental, quote unquote, disorder is less in the nature of the content of the experiences involved than in the attitude toward them, the individual's experiential style, the mode of interpretation, and the ability to integrate them. So he recognized that how this is perceived and valued depends on those types of variables rather than being called two distinct separate things. And then he said about the quote that it's an appropriate quote, but then he said the experiences of the mystic are often difficult and taxing and not necessarily all delightful. But the mystic is capable of seeing these challenges in the larger context of a spiritual journey that has a deeper purpose and desirable goal. And that actually ties into when I was in Banff having this difficult experience. Throughout that, I said, there's a higher purpose for this. There's a reason for this. I'm going through this for something better. I didn't know what it was, but I knew and I could feel it in the depths of my soul and my body. There is a reason for this. And unfortunately, when I returned back to the United States, I was actually harmed worse. So coming across this, I think gives a better description that the mystics who actually seek these types of experiences don't necessarily enjoy them, don't necessarily find them delightful, but they recognize there's value in these challenges. And so that concludes this segment. Thank you for taking some time, and I hope you found something of value.